She did her undergraduate degree there. And then she worked as an arborist for years, taking care of trees and getting to look at all the fungi that cause problems in them, both in Kentucky and on the West Coast and further down south, so in a lot of different habitats. And then went to University of Georgia for a master's in forest pathology, again, looking at those fungi and the things that they're doing in our trees. And more recently has worked with me for several years as a forest health technician, doing a range of outreach and research related to forest health. And throughout all of that time has had a great passion for fungi and for mushrooms, whether it is growing them herself or finding them, growing wild in the woods. So today, Megan is going to tell you a little bit about this amazing world of mushrooms, what they are, what they're doing. So thanks for joining us today, Megan.
Thanks, Dr. Crocker. Thank you for the great introduction, and I'm really happy to be here with you all today.
Oh, and one other note, you're just getting ready to start your PhD program. On Monday it begins. So a special thanks for you for joining us today.
It's exciting. It's exciting to get started with all of this. But today we're going to be talking about the fantastic world of fungi. Dr. Crocker, is there anything else we should cover before we get started?
No, just a reminder to everyone that this is the Kentucky Master Naturalist webinar series. So we have these 4 webinars in August. And if you're new to the Kentucky Master Naturalist program, make sure to check us out online. I'll put a link in the chat. And we do have a new fall training cohort starting at the beginning of September for anyone who's interested and wants to become a Master Naturalist, a series of great classes on all sorts of different topics related to the natural world. So if that's something you're interested in, make sure to check it out, and I'll put a link in the chat. Great. And you can take it away. Thank you, Megan.
Thanks, Dr. Crocker. Okay, so today, can everybody see this? If not, just say something in the chat, please, but you should be able to see the nice little mushrooms up here on the presentation. We're going to be talking about the fantastic world of fungi today. And this is a primer course in mushrooms and fungi to get you kind of started thinking about some of these concepts in mushroom ID and mushrooms in ecology, to broaden your interest from there if this is something that interests you. And I'm happy to take any questions. Please feel free to drop them in the chat as we go along or at the end of the presentation. All right, so what exactly is a mushroom anyway? We see these mysterious fungi that pop out of the ground after a nice hard rain. And I think that fungi often have this kind of mysterious connotation for people. And you see that in a lot of popular art that includes fungi. They're toadstools. They have gnomes or fairies sitting on top of them. Maybe if you step into a fairy ring, you might disappear and be whisked off to another world. Fungi are mysterious, and I think that people have often viewed them this way, but they don't have to be. Fungi are absolutely amazing. So fungi belong to actually their own kingdom. For a long time, people thought that fungi were in the same kingdom as plants, that they were essentially just really strange looking plants, because much like plants, they don't move around. They pop up, they grow in one place, and that's where they are their entire life. And for that and a few other reasons, for a long time, it was thought that they were just an odd kind of plant, but they're not. They're their own kingdom, completely separate from plants. And actually, they have more in common with animals and with protists than they do with plants. So you have more in common with a mushroom than you do with an oak tree. You don't have a whole lot in common with either one, but on a scale, you have more in common with that little mushroom than with a tree. So that they're doing their own thing out there in the world. And what is that? What do they do? Well, one of the big roles that fungi play is that they're nature's cleaning crew. A lot of macrofungi, and macro just means like macroscopic things that we can see, because there are a lot of fungi that are microscopic that we just don't ever see, things like yeasts and a lot of other microbial fungal organisms. But the majority of macrofungi, those fungi that we can visually see, they're going to be saprophytes, and that means they feed on dead and decaying material. So you can think of them as the cleaning crew of the world. They go around breaking down dead matter and cleaning that up along with a whole host of bacteria and microbial fungi as well. And if it wasn't for all these microbes, we'd be having these huge piles of detritus, dead material laying all over the place. So it's these microbial organisms and these fungi that really play a role in breaking all that down and creating nice, nutritious topsoil and keeping the whole cycle going. Fungi aren't always these saprophytes, these organisms that break down decaying materials. Sometimes they're parasites. The thing about a parasite is that it needs a living host. And there are quite a few fungi that have this kind of life strategy. I've included some of the less scary ones here, but things that parasitize trees, and we call these pathogens usually. Things like cedar apple rust, the big orange anemone looking glob in the upper left-hand corner, is a parasite on cedar trees as well as on apple trees. And the ringworm fungus in the upper right-hand corner, that is a parasitic fungus of a lot of mammals. It's one of the less scary fungal parasites that you can see on mammals. There's some others that are really, really disgusting and terrifying, and we won't talk about them now because it's just too unnerving. But ringworm is a very mild one by comparison, and that feeds on surface skin tissue in a lot of mammals. And then you have a whole host of parasites that are called like cordyceps fungi. And these are the true zombie apocalypse kind of organisms, because they tend to take control of insects and use those insects to complete their life cycle in really wild ways. If you find cordyceps or something interesting, I would really encourage you to look up a couple of really interesting nature documentaries that highlight cordyceps. You can listen to David Attenborough talk about cordyceps for a while and ants, and it's really, really fantastic. You can find a lot of those videos on YouTube if this is something that interests you. Sorry, there we go. Technical difficulties for a moment with the slide. But fungi aren't only these, parasitic organisms that can cause problems. They can also be really amazing. Fungi give us so many things that we enjoy and that are essential for our health sometimes. Things like beer and cheese and bread are all made in part with yeasts and with different fungi. And fungi have contributed a lot of antibiotics and important medicines that we use for human health. And fungi do amazing things. But what exactly is a mushroom? We talk about fungi, we talk about mushrooms. What are these things? Well, you can think of a fungus, the fungi itself, that's like the organism. And the mushroom, when we say mushroom, it's like saying apple. It's talking about the fruit of the fungus. So the body of that fungus is really this network of hyphae and this webby material called mycelium. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. But that's the body of the organism itself. Think of it like an apple tree is all of this mycelial tissue. And then that apple tree, eventually, it needs to make a fruit so it can reproduce, right? And that's for an apple tree. That's obviously an apple that's full of seeds. But in the case of fungi, when a fungus wants to reproduce, it also needs to create a fruit. And we call that fruit a mushroom. And those mushrooms, rather than seeds, have spores that are usually wind dispersed, although they can be dispersed in other ways as well. But that's the whole purpose of that mushroom. The mushroom isn't the organism itself, it's just the fruit. It's just the equivalent of that apple that's used to allow the fungus itself to reproduce. So we're going to be talking for a little bit about mushroom ID, and this is like your crash course, basics of mushroom ID 101. So when you want to identify a mushroom, you're out for a hike in the woods, it's a beautiful day, and you come across these really cool little mushrooms growing on the ground. I wonder what that is. Well, what are some of the things you want to look at to maybe try to inform your ID? Well, one of the first things that you want to take note of is where exactly is your mushroom growing? Is it growing under or near a certain type of tree? A lot of fungi are something called mycorrhizal, and that means that they live in a kind of symbiotic relationship with trees or with other plants. So sometimes when you see a mushroom growing under a certain type of tree, that might be able to help you inform your ID because this group of fungi are mycorrhizal with this species of tree. Or perhaps it's a parasitic fungus, it's feeding on the tree as a host. And parasites have preferences too. Certain parasitic fungi only prefer oak trees maybe, or beech trees. So knowing what that tree is and having a little bit of tree ID knowledge can really help you with sometimes narrowing down what kind of fungus you might be looking at also. Or maybe it's growing on a living or dead tree. And this applies to both parasites and saprophytes. Is it growing on a dead tree as opposed to growing up out of the soil? That tells you, first off, that this is a fungus that needs wood tissue for some part of its life cycle. That can really help you narrow things down. And also, it might be able to tell you whether it's a parasitic fungus, that prefers a certain species of tree to grow on as a host. Or maybe your fungi is growing on the grass or dirt. And I say on in quotation marks because something you want to keep in mind with fungi is that we just talked about how a lot of them like to grow on dead and decaying wood. So you see this little mushroom growing out of the ground. And you think, oh, it's growing out of the soil. But you might want to double check there under the base of that soil, because it could be that that mushroom is actually growing on a piece of rotting wood that you can't see that's under the surface of the soil. And that mushroom is actually a decay mushroom that's growing on wood and feeding on that wood rather than growing out of the soil itself. But there are also a large number of mushrooms that do just kind of grow up out of the soil. They're almost always saprophytes, feeding on detritus and decaying material, and they're just popping up and growing out of the ground right there. So understanding where your mushroom is growing is an important part of narrowing down that initial ID. So we're going to start from the bottom, work our way to the top, all the different parts of a mushroom and a little bit about them and keys you can look for to help you with your IDs. Mycelium, we already talked about this a little bit, and we talked about how the mycelium is the body of the fungus. It's like that apple tree. It's the true organism. And you don't usually see mycelium very much. Mycelium is this network of all of these different radiating tissues that the fungus that is the body of the fungus. And the purpose of this radiating style of growth, is to allow that fungus to gather water and nutrients and expand that network that the fungus uses as its life strategy, its growth strategy. Now, something to keep in mind is once in a while you'll hear people say that you can like visually identify fungi from their mycelium. You can't. You can't 100% identify a mushroom from the mycelium alone visually. Now, if you're using genetics and looking at the genetics of a fungus, which is something that people do quite a bit, then you can start to think about identifying fungi from their mycelium because you're looking at the DNA from that mushroom then and looking at the genes of that fungus. But visually, from a visual ID standpoint, you can't ID a fungus just by its mycelium. And that's with or without a microscope. It's not really 100% accurate. The largest organism in the world is thought to be a mushroom. It's called the humongous fungus, and it's this giant Armillaria mushroom colony out in Oregon. Armillaria is a genus of fungi, many of which are parasites. But it's not called the humongous fungus because it's like this one giant mushroom growing out of the ground. It's called this because of the mycelial network of this organism. It spreads so far and radiates out so far. It's thought to cover about 2,300 acres to 2,400 acres of land. And it's this mycelial network. It's all the exact same organism. That's where it gets this moniker as possibly being the largest organism on Earth. So that mycelial network can really, really spread out and cover a lot of territory. Now, what above ground? What you can see when you're looking at a mushroom, one of the first things you might want to look for is this base or bulb. Now, this isn't a characteristic that all mushrooms have, but there are some very important groups of fungi that do have this characteristic. And one of them is the Amanita fungi. Amanita are a genus as well as a family of fungi, and they contain some very notorious members. The little red-capped mushroom with the white dots that you see on all the Christmas cards and with fairies and gnomes sitting on them. That's an Amanita mushroom, as well as two of our most deadly mushrooms in North America, the destroying angel and the death cap mushroom. Those are all Amanita fungi. Now, there are other fungi aside from Amanita that have this base or bulb. And just because you find a mushroom that doesn't have this base or bulb, it doesn't mean that it's not an Amanita mushroom. So it's not 100% like foolproof. But very often, Amanita fungi will have this base, this bulb here at the bottom of the mushroom that is like a signature characteristic of that group of fungi that you might want to look for. And as you can see in these pictures, these are pictures I took, and you can see where, the soil has been excavated a little bit to really get a good look at that base. So you might need to like just brush away the leaf litter a little bit, see what's going on right there at the base of that mushroom where it meets the soil before you can really determine whether that bulb is present or not. And like we were talking about, this is an important characteristic of the Amanita fungi. That's a lot of these fungi do have this base or bulb. It's not a characteristic of fungi that are intrinsically toxic. A lot of fungi that are toxic do not have this base or bulb, and not all fungi that have a base or bulb are toxic. Mushrooms are confusing, but it is a good characteristic to watch out for. The next thing that you might want to look at is this universal veil that you will find on a lot of mushrooms. But again, it's a big characteristic of the Amanita mushrooms as well as several other genera of fungi. A lot of these Amanita species have a universal veil as well as a partial veil. And what happens is that universal veil, it's part of that egg there at the base of the mushroom. And when that mushroom starts to mature, it kind of like bursts out of this egg. Of course, it's not a true egg, but that's what we call it. And as it bursts out, the top of that egg sticks to the cap of the mushroom and tends to break apart into this universal veil and these remnants of that universal veil that often have distinct colors and patterns that you might look for that we call scales to kind of inform your idea of that mushroom. And if you're using mushroom ID books, you'll see this a lot. They'll ask you about like the distribution of the scales on the cap of the mushroom and what color are they, and are they distinct or more fibrous? Very, minute details sometimes, but things that you might want to try to look for. So that universal veil, is an important characteristic to look for. It's not always going to be there, but for a lot of groups it will be. And sometimes you might find just little remnants of it hanging out around the edge of the cap as well. There's a lot of different forms that the remnants of that veil can take. And we'll talk more about the annulus there in a minute. That's another remnant of the veil that occurs after that mushroom has emerged or has matured, and that can also be an important diagnostic key. It is also important to keep in mind that you want to look at mushrooms in different stages of development when you're trying to ID them, because the exact same mushroom can look really, really different as a fully expanded mature cap than as a small mushroom when it's just starting to emerge. So trying to see if there are other mushrooms around in the same area that you think might be the same species but are younger or older, to get an idea for what's changing in that mushroom as it matures, can be really helpful in informing your IDs as well. And that partial veil, it can take on a number of different forms. It can be like this kind of webby, almost like slimy looking material. You'll see that in some Stropharia fungi that hang down around the edge of the cap. A lot of the Lacrimaria and Cortinarius mushrooms have this more webby kind of remnants to that partial veil. And you can see where that veil's breaking away from the stipe of the mushroom. It's a part of that mushroom maturing, but those little veil remnants are left behind as an ID key. Again, you can see where that webbing is kind of breaking away from the stipe of this Cortinarius mushroom here. Cortinarius are a genus of mushrooms that we do have here in Kentucky. And this little violet Cortinarius has really interesting webbing that you can often see as that mushroom starts to expand and mature. And that's a remnant of that partial veil. The stem, we can call this a stem, a stipe, a stalk, whatever you want to call it, it's fine. You'll see people use different terminology in guidebooks also. So it's just good to be informed that these are all the exact same thing, and it doesn't matter which term you use to describe it. It's also an important ID key though. There's a lot of characteristics of the stipe that you might want to look at. Is it a certain color? A lot of bolete species will have very brightly colored stalks. And you might want to look at the color of that stalk, and is it the same as the cap? Is it different from the cap? To understand maybe a little bit more about what mushroom you might be looking at. You also might want to look at the texture of that stipe. Russula are a really good example of this. They tend to have stipes that are very brittle, and you'll see this description in a lot of guidebooks where they say that this stipe will snap almost like chalk when you break it. So that's another characteristic to look for, is like, is there some kind of texture to the stipe? You know, some of them you can also almost peel them like string cheese. So what does that stipe do when you start to break it apart? And you might want to look for any kind of reticulation or patterning on the stipe. Again, this is a characteristic of a lot of the boletes. It's usually not so dramatic as this reticulated stipe on the mushroom on the right here, but you might see some kind of a pattern along the stipe of that mushroom that can inform you as to what it might be. And this is common in the boletes, in some lactarius fungi, that you might see some kind of patterning or markings along the stipe. And you can see that a little bit more here, you know, different forms of striation and patterns along the stipe of the mushroom. And these are all boletes or bolete type fungi. They're really well known for having brightly colored stipes, for having patterning along their stipes. And boletes are notoriously difficult to ID. So, you know, any help that they can give us, like having these interesting stipe patternings, is very much appreciated to identify them. That ring, that remnant of the universal veil, we call that an annulus. And that's another characteristic that you might want to take a look at. This annulus, it's a remnant of that partial and universal veil. When everything is maturing, as that mushroom grows up and starts to break apart, that annulus will hang out around the stipe or the stem of the mushroom and can be used as a diagnostic key. This is a really beautiful clump of armillaria fungi I found growing at the base of this huge oak tree in Oregon that was totally parasitized by these guys. And this day, it remains one of my favorite pictures for really highlighting what this annulus can look like in some fungi. You know, in some mushrooms, it's a very substantial thing. It's kind of chonky and thick. You can really see it there and say, oh, look, there's the annulus of this mushroom. But on other fungi, it's not so persistent. On a lot of fungi, that annulus can be very ephemeral. And just because you don't see an annulus present on a mushroom doesn't mean that it didn't have one at one point. You know, it might have been worn away by wind and rain. Maybe an insect came along and just munched it off. There's a lot of reasons that an annulus might not be present, but it's a characteristic to look for. And this is another good time to look around for other mushrooms that you think might be the same species in an area, to see if maybe there's a younger, fresher specimen that still might have an annulus. If you think, I feel like this is a mushroom that should have an annulus, take a look around and see what some of the other fungi in the area have going on. But sometimes that annulus can be incredibly ephemeral, especially when you talk about some of these little, like, I call them like lawn mushrooms. There's a lot of different species of lawn mushrooms, but they're the ones that pop up out of your grass after a good rain. A lot of them tend to have very delicate, fragile, ephemeral annulus that can wear away very quickly. Amanita are another group that have an annulus. Armillarias, a lot of fungi will have that characteristic. But again, not all of them do. So maybe if you're seeing this mushroom and you think, oh, I think it's mushroom A, but then you start looking at your guidebook and realize, well, mushroom A never has an annulus and the specimen in front of you does. That helps narrow down your identification right away. Next, we're going to see like gills, pores, or spines. What exactly is growing on the underside of the cap of that mushroom? You know, there are fungi that have teeth on the underside, and they're not true teeth like we have them, but we call them toothed fungi. And there's these little toothy looking nubs all over the underside of that cap. And those teeth are where the spores of the fungus would be found. And understanding whether the fungi that you're looking at have gills, pores, have teeth is important for informing your ID. That's one of the very first things that you can look at. What's going on this mushroom? What kind of spore producing structures does it have? Because that's almost always a really strong characteristic of different groups. You'll know that this group of mushroom almost always has pores, almost always has gills, almost always has teeth, especially the teeth. They're usually pretty solid within a group. They're like, oh, we only grow teeth. Sometimes the pored and the gilled mushrooms can trick you. Like you think, oh, all these mushrooms only have pores, but then there's one or two exceptions of species that actually have gills instead. And you're just like, this is what nature is. It always likes exceptions. But for the most part, these categories will hold pretty true within groups of fungi. So, you know, looking at these toothed fungi, things like lion's mane, which is a very popular mushroom, the hedgehog mushrooms, jelly-toothed fungi, those teeth can have really different forms, but they're all where those spores are going to be produced. The fungi will use to reproduce and spread more mushrooms. Some fungi do have pores rather than teeth or gills, and this is a pretty large group of fungi. A lot of the boletes will have pores instead of gills. The vast majority of boletes are pored fungi. Maitake, the Laetiporus, which are, you might know as chicken of the woods fungi, they have pores as well. Dryad saddle, which we'll see a lot in the spring, and now moving into the fall, you'll start to see this one fruiting again. They have a lot of pores on the underside of the surface. That's actually the underside of the dryad saddle fungus right there. But they all have these pores, and that's where the spores are produced. Again, they're up in all these little tubes up inside the cap of the mushroom, and they're released when the cap is mature and those spores are ready to be released. But these pores can have a wide variety of shapes and colors and textures. Some of them have more hexagonal than round shapes. Sometimes they're really packed together so tightly that you can barely see they're even there, or they might be really widely spaced apart. They might be different colors. There's so much that you can see that can help inform your identification of what you might be looking at. And then we have the gilled mushrooms. And even though we're talking about them last within this group of like the different kinds of spore producing structures, this is really the most common group. This is one that most people think of when they think of mushrooms and what the underside of that cap might look like. But even within gilled fungi, there's a wildly variable number of forms that can occur underneath the cap of that mushroom. You know, gills can be different colors. They might be blue or pink or green. They can be really tightly spaced together, or they can be very widely spaced. And, you know, maybe those gills run down the stipe of the mushroom. Maybe they don't. There's a lot that you want to look at to inform what you might be seeing here. They can have different patterns and be wavy. You might see this interesting pattern where it seems like there are full gills and then like half gills in between them along the mushroom, or maybe where the gills fork at the edge of the cap. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. But there's a lot that you can see there. And the margin, even the margin of a mushroom, this Pileus, the margin of a mushroom, the Pileus is sometimes what the cap is called. And that edge can have different forms that might be helpful to look at. You know, is it swept up at the edges of the cap, or maybe it's rolled under a little bit? Could the edge of that cap be really blunted, or is it a very sharp edge? These are all the kinds of things that you might want to look at. And of course, you know, the cap itself. That cap can have a lot of different forms. And this is one of the first things that people notice about a mushroom. What kind of cap does it have? Is it like this huge umbrella looking flat cap, or is it this teeny tiny little thing that looks like the size of a pencil lead? You know, these are the things that people notice first off. But more than even just that initial, well, it's a huge mushroom or a really tiny mushroom, there's a lot of other things you might want to look at. Does that cap have a really slimy texture? There are some mushrooms that have a very slimy, almost snotty kind of top to the cap. Is there a latex that's secreted? The Lactarius fungi almost always secrete this latex from the cap of the mushroom when the gills are bruised or cut, or the cap of the mushroom is bruised or cut. Maybe it's a hairy cap that you'll see on some mushrooms, or maybe it has a very brittle texture like that russula. There could be interesting ornamentation along the cap of that mushroom, little bumps, or maybe a very like shredded appearance to the cap. These are all very informative characteristics of what the mushroom might be that you're looking at. You know, you can see that a little bit more here too. Sometimes it's an example of the remnants of that universal veil. They might be like little bumps, those veil remnants all over the top of the cap that you might see. And then you have the spores of a mushroom. And the spores, like we talked about, you can think of those as being like the fruit of the mushroom. They're like the seeds from an apple. Spores are how they reproduce, and spore color, size, and shape, these can all be important diagnostic features for mushroom ID, but not so much for field ID. This is something that you'll see used a lot with diagnostics, like when a sample comes into a lab. Yes, they're probably going to, you know, look at the, you know, extract DNA maybe and run some PCR to see what that mushroom is, but they're probably also going to take a look at those spores underneath a microscope and try to look at like the size and the shape, ornamentation of the spores, where the spores are located on the fungus itself underneath the microscope. They'll be able to see a little bit better how those spores are attached to the hyphae, which is like mycelium, underneath that microscope. But from like a macroscopic standpoint, spores aren't really helpful except in the case of spore prints. And a spore print is a way that you can kind of get a little more info about a mushroom that you might be stumped by, because sometimes spore prints are something that people use to help inform their IDs. And all you would do is take that mushroom cap, take off the stipe, the stem so that it's flat, put it on a piece of I like to use aluminum foil. That way, no matter what color the spores are, they'll show up. And cover it with the glass for a few hours, maybe overnight, but don't leave it much longer. I've had so many mushrooms melt into oozy masses because I forgot about them on a spore print. But after a little bit, you take that mushroom off of the aluminum foil, and you should be able to see this really nice spore print, which is where all the spores have been released from the cap of the mushroom. And rather than floating away on the wind like they would in nature, they've landed on your sheet of aluminum foil. And you can see what color the spores are to maybe help inform that ID of what the mushroom is that you might be looking at. And also it can just be really cool. It's a fun activity to get people thinking a little bit more about fungi, what they do and like how they reproduce. But from, a micro, and you can see a copy of a spore print here where you took the mushroom off and you can see all the black spores from this old man of the woods is what that mushroom is called. But up close under a slide, you can see these little basidiospores. And those are actually what the spores look like along the gills of a mushroom. So you have this mushroom gill and all these little basidiospores that are layered up against it. And when the environmental conditions are just right and that mushroom is mature, those spores are going to just waft away on the breeze. But, mushrooms, like we think of them with caps, aren't the only mushrooms that produce spores. Pretty much all fungi produce spores. And even within the macroscopic fungi, they have a wide variety of ways that they might reproduce with those spores. They're not all mushrooms with caps, with pores or gills or teeth, like you can see in some of the pictures here. But they might also be puffballs that keep all of their spores internally. They're called gastromycetes, like the stomach. They're stomach fungi. They have this internal area where they keep all their spores. And when that mushroom is mature, that will usually break open either with rain or from animals like brushing up against the mushroom, and all those spores will just be released in these huge cloud masses. The puffballs tend to reproduce that way. And you have things like jelly fungi that reproduce without anything that really looks like a mushroom cap at all, more like this slimy mass, but there's still spores there. They're just not so evident as they might be when you look at something with gills or pores. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the common fungi that we might see, growing here in Kentucky. We have an incredible diversity of fungi in Kentucky and in the eastern U.S. The Appalachian Mountains have some of the highest microbial diversity of fungi in the world, as far as we know. Some of, not the most highest, but some of the highest. So there's an incredibly wide variety of fungi here. I only know a small number of them. It would take forever to really become really good with the ID of all these fungi, but that's part of the fun, is that you just continue to learn and there's always something new to discover. But today we're going to be talking about some of the really common ones, some of the ones that you might see people asking you about, taking pictures of, saying, hey, what's this mushroom? So one of the first mushrooms on our list is, Trametes versicolor. This is the turkey tail mushroom. It's really, really common. It's a saprophytic mushroom. And we talked about how a saprophyte is something that feeds on dead and decaying material. It's part of that cleaning crew in nature. And turkey tails tend to grow on dead and decaying hardwood trees. You'll start to see them this time of year, but they'll be most evident in the fall and winter once a lot of things have lost their foliage. You might see these guys on down twigs and branches a little bit more easily. But they're pored fungi. So on the underside of that cap, they have all these little pores rather than gills or teeth or anything like that. And they're called turkey tail fungi because of all these patterns in these bands along the top of their fruiting body. Someone thought it looked a lot like the fan of a turkey's tail, which you can see a little bit. And that's where the mushrooms got their name. The top of that mushroom is going to be mildly pubescent. Pubescent means like kind of fuzzy or hairy almost. So there will be a little bit of a fuzzy texture to the top of that cap and those creamy white colored pores underneath. There's a couple of different fungi that are called false turkey tails. None of them are like inherently dangerous mushrooms, but they're not true turkey tails. And they'll have like gills on the underside of the cap or teeth, or maybe no pores at all. There's a few fungi that do that. But they're not true turkey tail. There are other mushrooms that are commonly called false turkey tails because people will confuse them with true Trametes versicolor. Laetiporus species, these are chicken of the woods. We have two species here in the eastern US. There are species of Laetiporus out west as well that are different. But here in the eastern US, we have Sulphurius and Cincinnatus. These are two different species of Laetiporus mushrooms. They are polypore fungi. Again, that means that they have all of those pores on the undersurface of the cap rather than gills or teeth. And these guys grow on hardwood trees, either as saprophytes on dead and decaying material, or as very weak parasites, meaning that you might find them growing on a living tree, but they're not so vigorous and aggressive on a living tree that they can kill their host. They're just probably feeding on a pocket of dead and decaying material within that living tree. They do grow on hardwood trees. With mushrooms that grow on conifers, there's a whole set of different rules. They're generally considered to be a little bit more chancy for things like consumption. Not that you should ever consume any fungi at all without knowing 100% what they are. But mushrooms that grow on conifers need to be approached with even more caution. But the majority of chicken of the woods in the eastern US is going to grow on hardwood trees. These chicken of the woods, they are orange and yellow on the top surface of the mushroom. And on the underside, on that pore surface, when you flip them over, you'll see that if it's sulphurious, they'll have a yellow color to the pore surface. And that makes sense, sulphurious, sulfur yellow. So that yellow pore surface on Laetiporus sulphuris, and on Cincinnatus, they'll have this creamy white color to the undersurface, to the pores. And I think of it as like the orange creamsicle of mushroom. It has this really beautiful creamy orange top surface with the white pores underneath. Let's see here. Maitake is the next mushroom on our list. This, again, is a pored mushroom. I think you'll see a little bit of a theme here. A lot of these mushrooms are going to have pores. They're commonly found in the fall of the year. That doesn't have anything to do with them having pores. It's just a common theme of this, of some of the mushrooms that we're looking at today that people commonly take pictures of. I think that often once the leaves are off the trees and things have started to lose their foliage, mushrooms maybe are picked up a little bit more by the eye because they just become more obvious without all of that green there. So sometimes you'll start to see people ask about some of these fungi a little bit more. But Maitake is either a parasite or a saprophyte. It's a little bit more of a vigorous parasite than Laetiporus, although it's still not like a true tree killer. It's just it's tougher. It can do a little bit more damage. But it's often called a hen of the woods because the top surface of this mushroom is this brown to gray, very ruffled looking surface. And I think that someone at one point thought it looked kind of like a hen snuggled up near the base of a tree, kind of feathered looking and with these soft gray and brown colors. But that's what the top surface of this mushroom looks like, with all these extremely small white pores on the underside of the mushroom. And this mushroom really likes to fruit on oak trees and on beech trees. You'll see it on other tree species as well. I've seen it on hickory and a variety of others. But oak and beech seem to be some of its favorites. And you'll see this fruiting again in the fall of the year. Cauliflower mushrooms, there are two species in North America. They look kind of like a head of cauliflower. People come up with the most creative names for fungi, really unusual things based upon what they think they look like. And cauliflower mushrooms, there's two species. Out west, there's Sparassis crispa, which is this really large cauliflower mushroom. It can grow to be this like volleyball size, very cool. It was one of the first mushrooms that I found on a trip out there, and I was absolutely thrilled because it's a bucket list mushroom. Amazing moment for me personally, maybe not so exciting for other people, but I thought it was fantastic. And in the eastern US, we have Sparassis spathulata, which is a much smaller species of Sparassis that grows here in the eastern US, generally associated with hardwood trees. Occasionally you can find it growing under conifers like hemlock. But this again is a parasitic or saprophytic mushroom. It's called a coral mushroom. And we didn't talk about coral fungi in our crash course on mushroom ID. But these are mushrooms that they don't have gills or pores or teeth. Rather, all those spores are born just along these folds of the tissue of the mushroom. There's no special receptacle for the spores. They're just growing there straight on the mushroom themselves. They're thought to maybe be an earlier branch of fungi, before fungi got really fancy and just started developing gills and pores. Maybe they were fungi with things like gastromycetes, so stomach fungi that we talked about, and coral fungi that produce their spores directly on the mushroom without any pores or gills or fancy stuff going on. And these guys tend to fruit in the late summer into early fall. I do know that they're fruiting right now. I've seen a couple, and I've had a couple people send me pictures saying, "Hey, what is this mushroom?" And sure enough, it's a coral mushroom. I'm sorry, a cauliflower mushroom. So these guys are fruiting right now, and they should continue fruiting into the early fall. Excuse me, just one moment. Thank you. Lion's mane is the next one on our list, and we're finally moving away from things that have pores. And we're going to talk about toothed fungi, because lion's mane, Hericium is the genus for lion's mane, are fungi with teeth. And there are several different species of Hericium in the US. We have Hericium ericanus, Hericium americanum, and Hericium coralloides. These are the three most common. They're saprophytes to mild parasites, but again, much like with the chicken of the woods that we talked about, they're not really an aggressive parasite in any way. Toothed fungi, so they produce all those spores on their teeth, not true teeth, but you can see where the name comes from. Lion's mane fungi are always going to be pure white. No matter the species, they have this pure white fruiting body, and they tend to fruit from very late summer through early winter, depending upon where you are in the US. Like if you are up in Minnesota or Michigan, you might start seeing these fruiting pretty soon. Down here, we'll see them in the fall. And if you go really far south, you won't see these fruiting until like winter. Down in South Carolina and Florida, I've found these fruiting in December and January because it's just then finally getting chilly enough there for these guys to actually fruit. They're very much temperature triggered with their fruiting. A lot of fungi actually are, where they require a certain range of temperatures to say, oh, all right, it's time to produce a mushroom, time to reproduce, time to spread spores. So you'll see that with the lion's mane, where it's not the right time of year yet, and then you hit this window. It's like, okay, temperatures are right, and they'll start to fruit. Multiple species of this mushroom found across North America, and here in the eastern U.S., again, it's primarily found on hardwood trees. If you go out west, there's a couple of different species of lion's mane, and also these species as well. But sometimes they'll be found growing in conifers. But here in the eastern U.S., nearly almost always hardwood trees. And especially things like oak and beech and maple tend to be some of the most common. Oyster mushrooms. So finally, something with gills. We've talked about all these pores and teeth and all this stuff, but oyster mushrooms have true gills. And they're Pleurotus mushrooms. Pleurotus ostreatus is the most commonly found oyster mushroom, but it's not the only member of the genus that we have here. But it's very common. It's found fruiting from, I would say, spring through winter, because there's a lot of different species of Pleurotus and even like different strains within species that will fruit at different times of the year. So you'll find them fruiting in the spring, a little bit in the summer, although summer is kind of a slow time for oyster mushrooms. And then moving into the late summer, fall, and early winter, you'll really see them fruiting a lot. They're called oyster mushrooms because they have this really distinctive smell that's kind of fishy. I don't find it like particularly repulsive or anything. It's just a very distinctive aroma, and that's where they get their name. They're saprophytes to weak parasites. And like we said, they can fruit through a wide range of seasons depending upon strain and location. And that fruiting body can be gray or tan or white on the top surface, but the gills will almost always be white. So different colors on the top, nothing really wild, just gray, white, tan, although there's now a golden oyster mushroom that has essentially escaped from cultivation, and you'll see it growing wild. And that's going to have a yellow top surface. But there are other mushrooms that grow on wood that have a yellow top surface that are not safe. So best not to assume just because it's a yellow mushroom growing on wood that it's a golden oyster. There's a lot of other things it could be too. But oyster mushrooms, they have decurrent gills. That means that the gills kind of run down the stipe of the mushroom. So if there's the underside of that cap, and rather than just stopping at the edge of the cap, the gills tend to run down the stipe a little bit. That's called decurrent. And that mildly fishy aroma that we talked about. Always growing on wood. These guys don't grow straight up out of the ground. They're always going to be growing on wood. And then we have the chanterelles, and these are a really large group of fungi, relatively speaking. There's over 46 different species of chanterelles and their friends, their relatives, here in North America. So a wide range of diversity. But they belong mainly to the genera of Cantharellus and Craterellus. These are the two genera that most chanterelles belong to. And they can take on a wide variety of forms, like you can see here. You know, they can be bright orange and incredibly tiny. They can be black, like these horn of plenty or black trumpet fungi. They tend to have really interesting gill arrangements because chanterelles and their friends don't have true gills. They have what are called these pseudo gills, where the gills sometimes can be kind of folded over, almost blunted looking, not so sharp. And the gills almost always fork near the margin of the cap. So you have one gill starting at the stipe, it runs up towards the cap, and as it reaches that cap margin, it will fork in two. That's very common with a lot of chanterelles. But there are also chanterelles that seem to have nearly no gills at all. And you can see they kind of run the gamut even in this picture, from things with very distinct gills on the right to on the left, things, mushrooms that have almost no gills at all. But you can see a little bit of that forking here. This is a really lovely picture of a true smooth chanterelle with the little like forking of the gills on the underside of the cap, right there where it reaches the margin. But a really wide variety of chanterelle fungi. However, like the theme that ties them all together tends to be these forking gills on the undersurface of the cap. There are other mushrooms that do that too. There are some other characteristics we can talk about for chanterelles, but we just don't have time for that right now, unfortunately. But I just want you all to keep in mind that things aren't always what they seem with fungal ID. You know, there's a lot of fun mushrooms out there to look for. I love hunting for mushrooms, taking pictures of them. But you also want to be cautious because fungi need to be treated with respect. You know, they can be dangerous too. And that doesn't mean that they should be feared. It means they should be treated with caution and respect. And this is a great example. You know, the morel mushroom, it's one of our most iconic fungi. People go wild for morels every spring. But there's a little look-alike to morels. Well, it's not really much of a look-alike, but sometimes when people are just starting out with ID, they might get these two confused. So on the right, you have this beautiful little morel mushroom. And on the left, you have, oh, now they switch sides, I'm sorry. On the left, you have a true morel. And on the right, you have this false morel. It's a Gyometria species. And often people will get them confused with true morels. But there's a lot of differences. You know, true morels are hollow in the center, in the stipe, whereas false morels have all this tissue in the center, in the stipe of that mushroom. True morels have like true pits to the cap, whereas false morels have this different kind of texture. There's a lot that you can read that will help inform you on the differences between these mushrooms. But it's just very important to keep in mind that the Gyometria fungi are fungi that you don't want to consume because they actually have a chemical component in them that's very similar to rocket fuel. So rocket fuel, believe it or not, is not something you can digest. And these mushrooms will make people very ill. So it's important to understand what the differences are between the true morels that people are searching for and these false morels that might trip some people up. It's interesting to note that in other parts of the world, people will eat these Gyometria fungi with no issue. But what has been found is that in other areas where these fungi grow, they don't produce these chemicals the same way that the Gyometria that grow here in the Eastern US do. So sometimes, you know, I'll have someone say, well, no, that's not true. I've seen pictures of people eating these mushrooms in Eastern Europe where they're actually very popular and common as an edible mushroom. It's like, well, but their Gyometria are different from ours. There's so much nuance with mushrooms that you have to keep in mind. A good example, another example of things aren't always what they seem is Pleurotus. These are angel wing mushrooms. And to the untrained eye, they can look a little bit like oyster mushrooms, like Pleurotus mushrooms. But they're not. They're a different genus, although they are somewhat related. And for a long time, it was thought that Pleurotus, angel wings, were safe to consume until 2004, when about 17 people in Japan died after eating these mushrooms. And it was found that they died from a kind of acute encephalopathy. But they're still not really sure why, like what exactly caused that encephalopathy, what in those mushrooms caused them to die? Because the thing that linked all these deaths was that they had consumed these mushrooms. It's thought that it was some kind of unstable chemical compound within the mushroom, and people still eat angel wings in some places without any incident. However, to me, the thing about fungi is they're so much fun to look for, but I'm really lucky. I live in a country where where I am privy to food security. I never have to worry about starving to death. And so I just don't think that there's any mushroom meal that's really worth my kidneys or my liver or my brain, my life, to possibly consume one of these fungi and have really dangerous consequences. So, after this happened, angel wing mushrooms went off the menu, but for me and for a lot of other people as well. This is another good example, as is these jack-o'-lantern fungi. And often about this time of the year, so you all might run across this now. I actually had this question last week from a friend of all people. People will confuse these jack-o'-lantern fungi, these Amphilotus fungi, with chanterelles. So you have jack-o'-lanterns on the right, chanterelles on the left. And they can be mistaken for one another because we're reaching the end of chanterelle season, but they're still fruiting. And we're at the beginning of jack-o'-lantern season. In a lot of different ways. Where Halloween's only like 2 months away. But these jack-o'-lantern fungi are sometimes confused for chanterelles. But these guys can make you pretty sick. They're not life-threatening for healthy people, but they will make you maybe wish that you weren't going to see the next day, with how miserable you might feel for a little bit with these guys. So important to understand the differences between them. And some of those differences are that jack-o'-lantern fungi have true gills. If you slice them in half, they would be orange all the way through, whereas chanterelles are white if you slice them in half. But the purpose of this isn't to tell you about all the differences between these two mushrooms. It's just to help you get a little bit of perspective on what some of these nuances might be, the fact that there are some dangerous lookalikes out there, and in a minute where you can go to help learn a little bit more about maybe how to tell them apart. The last example I want to share with you all, though, is perhaps the most important one, and that's the destroying angel mushroom. This is Amanita mushroom that grows here in the eastern US. I saw one just a couple weeks ago out hiking with friends. So they're growing here in Kentucky right now. And it's this beautiful, innocent looking little white mushroom, much like the button mushrooms that you find in the store. But this mushroom is one of the most deadly toxic mushrooms that we have here in North America. It causes liver failure and sometimes kidney failure if consumed. And that is a pretty serious thing. Again, no mushroom, in my opinion, is worth your life to possibly consume it. So this is one to keep in mind. And every year there are a few people who die after consuming the destroying angel or its cousin, the death cap, which is another species of Amanita mushroom. So really important to keep in mind that not only can fungi just make you feel really sick for a while, but there can be long-term, possibly life-threatening consequences to eating these fungi without careful ID and consideration of what exactly it is that you have beforehand. Yeah, like we've been talking about, picking and eating wild mushrooms, they can kill you. These are 3 of the most deadly mushrooms we have in North America. And you can see the pains that someone has gone to let people know in multiple languages that these mushrooms are dangerous. And these are all mushrooms that we have here in North America: the death cap and destroying angel, which we just talked about, and the deadly galerina, which is more of a winter fruiting species. Thankfully, it doesn't seem to affect as many people, just because I don't think that people realize that there's some like it that are edible. But I think that knowledge is becoming more common, and I wonder if maybe we'll see more cases of galerina poisoning on the rise. Who knows? But another very deadly toxic mushroom here in North America. So really quick, a few helpful resources to set you on your mushroom journey. I find that there's a lot of misinformation online. I think we all know that by now. But if you want to go online, because it is an amazing resource to find information on mushrooms, there are some really, really great, reliable resources out there for you. Mushroom Expert is my #1 go-to actually for mushroom ID. Michael Kiao, who runs the website, he's fantastic. All of his information is very factually based. He references research and publications, and all of his information is based on fact, not anecdotal evidence. You won't find a lot of information on how to cook a mushroom to have it taste best, but you're going to find a lot of really good, solid info on how to ID fungi very reliably. I love his website. I can't recommend it enough. MycoWeb is also a really nice factual resource. It's going to have really excellent information and quite nice pictures. And then Tom Volk's Fungi. Tom Volk is a professor at University of Wisconsin. He's fantastic. And he has a mushroom blog that is not being updated anymore, but it's an amazing wealth of resources and really fun anecdotal stories, as well as very factual and scientific based information about fungi. He weaves it all together into this fantastic storytelling that I really love. And I can't recommend his website enough. Just if you like fungi and you think they're fun and interesting, you're going to find some really cool information on his blog. And as far as mushroom ID books go, these are a few that I really like. Mushrooms Demystified is like the Mushroom Bible. David Aurora wrote it. He's an amazing mycologist. But this isn't really a field guide book. It's called the Bible for a reason. It's pretty substantial and heavy. So not really one to take out with you backpacking, but still an amazing resource for fungi. Mushrooms of the Southeast is a little bit smaller and lighter, maybe more backpack friendly. There's not quite as much breadth and depth to the species covered, but it's very picture heavy, which can be nice if you're getting started with ID. There's a couple of other picture heavy ID books that are a good place to get started. And then All the Rain Promises, it's like the Tom Volk website version of a book. It's also written by David Aurora, who's just amazing. But it's based upon ID for the Western US, but his stories, the anecdotes that he includes in there, as well as really interesting ecological information about the species, makes it a wonderful book, in my opinion. I love it. It's one of my favorite mushroom field guides, even though I can't apply it to ID here in the Eastern US. It's still excellent, and I highly recommend it. And, I would advise against the mushroom hunting apps. iNaturalist is great, and if you snap a picture of a mushroom with iNaturalist, it might help you figure out maybe what genus you want to start looking at for your ID, but I encourage people to never rely fully on mushroom hunting apps for their IDs 100%, because these apps are able to be wrong, and mushrooms, as we've learned, are not something that you want to be wrong about. And of course, you can always reach out to Forest Health Extension here at UK. Dr. Crocker is an amazing resource for mushrooms. She's incredibly knowledgeable. And there's a few other people here as well who might be able to answer some questions about fungi, depending upon what it is that you'd like to know. So thank you all so much for being here today. I really appreciate your time and your attention. And if there are questions about mushrooms, I'd be happy to answer them to the best of my ability.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Megan. That was fantastic. And there are certainly some questions in the chat. I'll read them out to you, but if you have additional questions, make sure you put those in there and we'll try to get to them. And I know that we're at 11, so if you've got to run, that's no worries. But we're happy to have you joining for the Master Naturalist series, and we hope to see you for lichens next time. So we had a few questions for you. We had one question about the brain-looking fungus that I think was when you were talking about morels. I'm guessing that was a false morel. Is that right?
It was like, let's see, where is?
Yeah, they can have these really abnormal shapes, right? Look at that one. Yeah. And the slide before, maybe, I think you had another. Yeah,
these guys are just, they're wild looking. What was the question? Because I think I missed that one, Dr. Crocker. I'm so
it's just
sorry.
What is the brain looking fungi on the previous? It was that one. It was a false morel, this false morel right there.
Yeah, and they have that kind of brainy appearance. And, on first glance, when people are just learning about mushrooms, It's easy to see how you might confuse the two if you're just getting started, but there are a lot of stark differences as well, and seeing them side by side can really kind of highlight those differences.
We,
There are some great resources out there too on like telling the two apart.
we had another question. Is there any danger in just touching toxic mushrooms? And I know this is one
Oh,
that a lot of folks have.
sure, absolutely. And when I started really getting into mushrooms years ago, it was a concern that I had as well. But after a lot of reading, it's not a concern really. Just touching a toxic mushroom, these toxins aren't something that can be dermally absorbed. They can't be absorbed through your skin. Now you don't want to like pick up a destroying angel and crumble it up and then lick your hands. And that would be a very bad idea. And often when I've been like handling mushrooms for hours, I will try to clean my hands off before maybe eating, just to be really safe. But these aren't toxins that can be absorbed through your skin. So that's not a concern. Just handling this mushroom and looking at it maybe to get some good pictures of different features or to see what's going on the underside of the cap. There's no danger of just touching that mushroom, having it hurt you.
We had another question. Someone had asked about the type of mushrooms that have a cage that blooms from beneath the cap, which is, I think, those stinkhorns. Do you know the ones that we've seen the videos of this like beautiful kind of frilly lace that kind of as they emerge. That's what I was thinking of. Is that what comes to mind for you as well?
That's what comes to mind as well, as those, that this skirt kind of cage that drops down as the mushroom matures. And like Dr. Crocker said, those are stinkhorn fungi. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to talk about stinkhorn fungi today, which is sad because they're amazing. But there's only so much about mushrooms that we can fit into 1 hour, and stinkhorns got cut. But they're really cool mushrooms. They tend to produce their spores in like this usually very disgusting smelling like matrix, this slimy mass on top of the mushroom. It smells like something rotting because this mushroom wants to attract flies and other decay attracted insects to spread those spores. So it's reproduction strategy for the fungus, but it smells revolting. Now the one that has the skirt on it is actually a tropical species. You'll see that growing in Central and South America. We don't have that particular one here, sadly. But we do have some really, really cool stinkhorn fungi here in the Eastern US. You'll usually see those growing on like mulch because they're true saprophytes. They feed on dead and decaying stuff. They love to grow on mulch. And that's usually where you'll see them growing around here. In Georgia, I would see tons of these. There's this one lot that you would know when the stinkhorns were fruiting because you would walk by and you'd be hit like the smell of carrion just wafting at you and look over, and sure enough, there's all these stinkhorns just growing out of the mulch like wild. But a really cool group of fungi, and sadly, we didn't have a chance to cover them.
So one of the questions was about why do most mushrooms have gills as opposed to other types? And I think that, one thing I think that your presentation today did is that it opened eyes to the fact that we have a lot of mushrooms that have these really diverse, we have gilled mushrooms, we also have pores and teeth and other things. Now, certainly a lot of them have gills. Do you have any reflections on these different forms that mushrooms have of getting their spores out there?
Sure. And, I don't think that there's a solid answer to this, but there are some theories. And the most common theory, and the one that I'm inclined to, is that this is an evolutionary advantage. That mushrooms, like we talked about with the coral fungi and the gastromycetes, which we didn't get to talk about too much, they are earlier fungi. And as fungi evolved over time, they developed fancier methods of releasing their spores. I think that probably if you start looking at it from a physics standpoint, and I've heard a little bit about this, but I am not in any way knowledgeable about physics, so I just know what other people have told me. Having all these gills really increases surface area. So if you have all these gills and all these spores up along the sides of every single gill, you actually have a much larger surface area that those spores can be distributed across to then increase the odds of some of those spores creating more fungi. So from what I understand, that's kind of the predominant theory as to why gills are more common among mushrooms now. They're a newer adaptation. They're kind of the fancy new thing, the hot trend among fungi these days. But that might be why, is it's an evolutionary adaptation to increase spore dispersal.
We had a question about apps for our mushroom ID, and someone asked about iNaturalist, and is that useful? And I'll admit I've used it before just to be like, I wonder what iNaturalist is going to give me for this mushroom. And sometimes it's really good and it can be really useful. I think it is a tool in your toolkit. But it can only it only bases it based on one image that you give it, and that's typically going to be the image of the top of the cap. So it's going to be inherently pretty limited there.
Absolutely, I totally agree. What Dr. Crocker said is I couldn't have said it any better. There are limitations to these mushroom apps. They can be a fun resource to use to say, okay, I wonder what iNaturalist thinks, but not to take it as a 100% accurate ID. It's all based upon the pictures that you use, and it doesn't take into account things like season or location or anything else. It's just based upon those pictures. So like Dr. said, a great resource and toolkit, but not your final verdict on ID.
We had a question about monitoring populations of fungi long-term, and kind of, are there any particularly uncommon fungi in Kentucky that you're aware of or that we should be concerned about? Monitoring fungal populations is tricky. I'll say that just because most of the time they're going to be microscopic. You will never see them, and the emergence of these mushrooms is very ephemeral. So that's a tricky thing to do.
It is. It's incredibly difficult to monitor mushroom populations for the reasons that Dr. Crocker said. A lot of the time, how can you monitor something if it's all occurring below ground and you can't see it? It is something that people think about and that there's consideration of. There are a few states now, just like I think 2, that have started to include some fungi as protected within their state conservation. But for the most part, it's not really something that we think about. Sorry, there's a lot of background noise here today. It's not really something that we think about too much. And as far as I know, there aren't really any threatened fungi in Kentucky, at least that we're aware of, maybe because we don't monitor very well.
Yeah, maybe those that are associated with some of the trees that are dying, or exactly, other things like that. But other parts of the world, I know that they can be different.
Yeah, in other parts of the world, things like Hericium fungi are actually on the red list, on the endangered species list throughout a lot of Europe. And they're protected species. It is illegal to harvest them. It's illegal to mess with them because their populations have become so low. And that is something that I think about sometimes, with fungi that have become really popular for foraging here. What is our responsibility to these natural populations to treat them maybe almost like we do wildlife, where you need to be sustainable with them with your harvest? It's not something that we really think about with mushrooms right now here. But I wonder if that is something that we'll need to consider in years to come.
And I think that raises a good point, in that in a lot of places, where I'm familiar with people with over harvesting issues with mushrooms, one of the challenges is not so much damaging that mushroom directly, because the mushroom is just the fruiting body of a fungus, but that these harvesting procedures, if they're super intensive, can change the environment so much that those fungi can't grow there anymore. And so thinking about that, thinking about kind of intensity of harvest, are we being good stewards of the environment while we do that? Are we, not compacting the soil and not removing all the leaf litter? So more fungi will grow in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we had a question about a couple of questions kind of along the lines of different types of logs. So one question about, why are conifers not hosts for many fungi? And another question, what are the best and safest practices to inoculate logs with edibles? And I know you got a lot of experience with that, as well as a lot of experience with the fungi that grow on conifers as well, because on the West Coast and further south, there are far more conifers than we have, and they get different fungi, right?
Absolutely. And, I think that the thing is maybe not so much that there aren't a lot of conifers that are hosts for fungi as that in our area, there's not a lot of conifers that act as fungal hosts. Now, of course, all of our pines, they have all kinds of fungi that grow on them as well. But if you think about the makeup of our tree species diversity here in Kentucky and throughout most of this part of the US, Kentucky, Ohio, Tennessee, Western North Carolina, that tree population is predominantly made up of hardwoods. Therefore, the majority of the mushrooms you're going to see are hardwoods because that's what we have growing here. Now, if you go further south, where pine is king in a lot of parts of the deep southeast, or if you go out to the west coast, where you have Douglas fir everywhere and other hardwood species predominate, you're going to see an entirely different host of fungi, most of which have evolved to grow on conifers because that's what's available to them. So if conifers aren't a popular host here simply because they're not our predominating tree species. But if you go to areas where there are a lot of trees that are conifers, you'll see mushrooms that grow on them. Now the thing with
I was going to say, but a lot of those mushrooms that people try to grow, if we kind of ease into that second question, things like shiitake and oysters, you wouldn't necessarily grow them on conifer wood or sawdust, right?
No, you wouldn't. Conifers are interesting for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that they have this really unique host of chemicals that conifers have in their tissues, and that can sometimes have an influence on how well these fungi can inoculate those logs. Also, a lot of conifers are softwoods. They tend to decay more rapidly than hardwoods do. And this can become a problem, especially with things like shiitake and Hericium when people try growing those. First off, they just grow better on hardwood. Those both grow really well on things like oak, beech. Those are two of the best. Maple is also a good tree species to use. Those are some of the three most common: oak, beech, and maple for growing these mushrooms. So there's just more available to those mushrooms within that host tree. And also they're not going to decay as quickly as, say, pine will, or maybe another conifer species. So when you have a mushroom like a shiitake mushroom that needs at least 1 full year to colonize that log before it can start to fruit, and then from a production standpoint, you might want to have that log fruit for 2 or 3 years to really get your money's worth out of it. That's a lot of time and investment for a log that might already be decaying if it's a conifer log. So there's a few different reasons that some of these hardwoods are preferable for production purposes and for inoculation, and also why the mushrooms that grow in them are different. Dr. Crocker, do you think that answers that question pretty well?
If it doesn't, let us know, and we'll think more. You did get one additional question that we can touch on. Are there more than one type of morel, and what determines their mature size?
Sure. So there are actually quite a few different species of morels that grow here in the eastern US. There's different species out west too that actually have a very different ecology, but we won't talk about that right now. If you're curious, look up like Western morel ecology and you can have a really fascinating read. But here in the eastern US, we do have different species and they do have different mature sizes. As far as determining mature size, I think that's more of just an experience thing. When does it look like a morel? When does it look like a mature mushroom with those pits really being apparent and that cap looking like the mature cap of a mushroom?
Do you think that the final size is more based on environmental conditions after it emerges, or is there something else that determines how big will that, sometimes you'll get them and they're mature and they're tiny, and other times they're big?
I think that's partially species dependent, but also partially based upon environmental conditions. If it's really great environmental conditions, once in a while you'll see a picture of someone with this huge chonky morel. And I think that's mostly based upon environment and luck. Nobody found it. No animal or enterprising, wild creature found this morel to eat it. And so if it's the right species and the environmental conditions were right, it got to be super huge. But for the most part, morels aren't going to get very large. And that's both based upon the genetics of their species as well as just the environment they're growing in. I know that's not the most satisfactory answer, but like with a lot of things with fungi, it depends. Maybe Dr. Crocker has something else that she'd like to add in that regard, because she knows this stuff.
Our native morels are mycorrhizal, right? So the morels that grow in our area are going to be mycorrhizal associated with tree roots. However, there are morels that grow elsewhere that sometimes also grow here that are more saprobic. So they're breaking down dead material. You might find them in mulch. So if you hear of someone cultivating morels, more than likely they're not successfully cultivating the ones that grow native around here. They're growing a different type that would grow on that dead material.
Yeah. Morel cultivation is something that a lot of people are excited about. It could be really interesting if someone can work out how to do it really well and effectively. But I think it's pretty experimental right now.
Yeah, someday.
Someday.
Great. Well, again, Megan, I just want to thank you for a great presentation today. Just so much good information. And I know you're a wonderful resource in general for everything mushroom related. And happy to have you on. And next week, don't miss Kendall's presentation on lichens, right, Lori?
Yep, and it's a good one. So Kendall McDonald with the State Nature Preserves is going to present on lichens. What are they and why they're important and how we use those as bioindicators. So, and it's a great presentation. I've seen hers before, so you'll really enjoy it.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to it. And then one other thing for anyone who hasn't seen this yet, if you're interested, we have a brand new Kentucky Master Naturalist training cohort that's going to start this fall in September, run through December Fridays at 10. So if you've been coming to these weekly ones, kind of similar, only this is intended for kind of new Master Naturalists. So the core material, the core training that we think would be really beneficial to anybody who's interested in becoming a Master Naturalist. It's also the part of the required material you need to become a Master Naturalist. So a 15-part online training with all sorts of different great speakers on topics like geology, soils, water resources, botany, wildlife, entomology, and more. And if you're interested, make sure to check that out on our website. Sign up for it. There's a $100 program fee, but there are scholarships available. So let us know and, look forward to that. So thanks everyone again for joining today. Anything else, Lori?
No, I don't believe so. I think we're good. I thought it was a great presentation. Thank you again, Megan. We got all kinds of people saying, great, this is wonderful. Another reason to get out into the woods. So yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you all for asking me to be here today and for your all's attention. I really appreciate it.
All right, everyone, have a great rest of your day.
See you later.
Bye.